Well, good evening to our friends on the live stream and welcome to the UK launch of Pete Gregg's brand new book, Dirty Glory. We are so glad that you could join with us here in Guildford, wherever you are in the world. So welcome to the event. Can I please invite our very special guest, Mr. Pete Gregg, to join me up here? Pete, this is so exciting. Brand new book, and this is the long-awaited sequel to Redmond Rising, which tells the story of the 24/7 prayer movement. Could you just tell us a little bit about the impact of Redmond Rising?
Yeah, it was a long time ago that I wrote Redmond Rising, simply to capture some of the stories of the first 5 years of the 24/7 movement. We were really surprised by all that was going on all around the world. And I really didn't think very many people at all would ever read the book. I couldn't see why anyone would read a book about a prayer movement. I was fairly confident my mum would read it and one or two others. But actually, it has gone all over the world. It's been translated into more languages than I've lost count. I started to keep all the different languages on one of my bookshelves, but I've given up on that. And the impact has been extraordinary. I was just in Nashville a few weeks ago, and so many people coming up saying that book changed my life and whatever. And what's amazing is it's very simple. It's just a bunch of stories. And as my abrasive New Zealand friend Andrew Jones once said to me, it must be God, Pete, because it's not that great a book, is it? And the truth, it isn't that great, but God seems to be using it to stir people up. So that was Redmond Rising, which was sort of the prequel to Dirty Glory.
Brilliant. I actually read Redmond Rising. I was just at school at the time. Not to make you feel old at all, Pete, but I remember reading it, and it was the first Christian book I'd ever read that I could not put down, and it just conveyed to me something of the Christian faith that I'd never encountered before. It was a faith that actually took everything. It wasn't just a Sunday faith, but it was something that could impact your whole life. And the stories of miracles in there are just so inspiring. And so it's very exciting to have the sequel out now and see the impact that might have. And without giving away too many spoilers for those who are going to read the book, they both actually start in the same place, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, I mean, the first 5 years we saw a lot of extraordinary things and a lot of very painful things actually as well. But there have been even more amazing things since Redmond Rising, and so one of the reasons for writing this was to get that down. But yeah, they both begin in Cape St. Vincent, which is the most southwesterly place in Europe. The first time I went there, in the middle of the night, God gave me a vision, and I saw an army of young people rising up out of an atlas. I didn't talk about it for years because I was worried that people would think I was nuts. And then it started to happen as 24/7 broke out. And I'd always kind of thought, what is that place where that thing happened to me? And then when Sammy got very, very sick, and we spent a long time in Southampton General Hospital, I did a deal with God, and I said, if she ever gets out of here, we're going to go back to that place and try and make sense of all of this. So we trundled back to Cape St. Vincent. Sammy had a big hat on her head to protect the scar from the sun, and we stood on those cliffs praying and trying to process the previous years, which had been more wonderful and terrible than anything we could imagine. And to be honest, it was pretty underwhelming. I don't know if you've ever been back to somewhere that's been very significant for you and you try to make it meaningful and it isn't. And we drove away, and we turned on the radio in our little Jeep, and we found out that we had been there at the moment that would redefine everything. So we made a little film to introduce this book, because that's where Dirty Glory starts. Redmond Rising starts with the vision of an army and my first visit there. Dirty Glory starts with my return and something even more remarkable.
Wow. Well, without further ado, then let's watch the Dirty Glory promo video.
Amazing. Nick Weasley made that. And Jake.
Yeah, so the star of the show is actually here in the audience tonight. Jake, where are you? Jake. Pete, I noticed you picked rather a good-looking young lad to play the younger you.
I don't know what you're talking about. Jake, I did Jake a lot of favours. Jake did brilliantly, and I'm so glad he had to stand on that treacherous precipice, not me. It was terrifying.
You're also actually wearing your Dirty Glory promo outfit right now.
I don't have very many clothes.
Brilliant. So Redmond Rising was about the first 5 years of the 24/7 prayer movement, and now Dirty Glory covers the next 10 years. And some incredible things that God has done in that time. But I guess what probably a lot of us here are wondering is, why Dirty Glory? What's the title all about?
Well, I called it Dirty Glory firstly because I just liked the sound of the name. To me, it sounded like a Johnny Cash song, and I like Johnny Cash. But also it's a book about the paradox of grace. It's about the fact that God's story from beginning to end describes his glory getting dirty and his world getting blessed. And so if you think about it, God breathes into a handful of dust, and that's the beginning of Genesis. And the glory of God becomes an incontinent, inarticulate baby in a dirty manger. That's the beginning of the New Testament. And then he grows up and he recruits a bunch of no hope, zealots and fishermen and crooked tax collectors, and says, just go take my glory to the ends of the earth. And so Dirty Glory tells loads of stories of very ordinary people, very messy, messed up people like us, finding ourselves encountering the glory of God, and then trying to take that glory into the darkness. And so that, there's stories of Kelly, who's working or was working in Mexico, in Boys Town, in a walled city of prostitution, and of John Peterson, whose first baptism service was on a nudist colony in the hippie era, and he says you had to be very careful where you put your hands, and of Brian Heasley, who we're going to hear from in a bit, I think, and the work there with Tracy and their kids in Ibiza, which the Daily Mail are called Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's full of stories of the way that the glory of God belongs in the dirt, and he calls dirty people like us to take his glory into his broken world.
So beautiful. And so it is, as you said, it features a lot of amazing stories, some of which we're going to get to hear little snippets of tonight. And I've actually had the privilege of being able to read it, and some of these stories are... Don't read them on public transport, is my advice, because some will make you cry, some will make you laugh out loud. But I think most of all what they do is they're really challenging, actually, and they call us to something deeper and a bigger adventure with Jesus. But the book, as well as these stories, it's also got some really important teaching in there about prayer, mission, and justice. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Hannah actually wrote the study guide for the book, which means that it's a great resource for, churches and small groups and whatever can actually really try and apply the teaching into their lives together. But one of the core themes in Dirty Glory is what we call the presence paradigm. And that is the notion that we're designed to walk and talk with God, to live in his presence, to practice his presence in the ordinary, normal world. That normality is to have relationship with God, abnormality is to live as if he doesn't exist. And that everything flows out of God's presence and back into God's presence. So, for example, we don't just pray to get people saved, we get people saved so they can pray. And so the book explores that, and you can trace it right the way through from Adam and Eve talking to God in the cool of the evening in the garden, through, tabernacle and temple, and then Jesus, who is the presence of God amongst us, and says, come and have a picnic, and let's go fishing, and then how on the day of Pentecost his followers get the little flame on their heads, and they become the Holy of Holies. They become the tabernacle, the temple, and then they go and they take the presence of God out, and then the Bible says one day the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God, even as the waters covered the sea, so the whole creation will have come home to the presence of God. So that's the presence paradigm, and I think it actually has profound implications to the way that we live, the way we do church, the way we do everything. We also talk about the house of prayer motif and what that means, and of course we explore prayer, mission, justice, because those are sort of key rallying cries for the 24/7 movement.
Brilliant. And I'm sure lots of people here have lots of questions that they'd like to ask you about the book. And we are actually going to open the floor up for questions a little bit later in the evening. But also, if you're watching online at home, wherever you are in the world, you can also ask Pete any questions that you might have using social media. So use the hashtag #DirtyGlory to ask your question, and we will have a little space for that later in the evening.
And just for my mum who doesn't do Twitter and won't know how to, Mum, well done for getting on this. You can just text me directly and I'll try and answer your questions.
No one else's mum can text Pete, but...
Nick Beasley's mum is that.
So Pete, those of us in the room can buy the book here tonight, or if you're watching it online, you can pre-order it. Although it has actually already come out in America. How come they got it
those
first?
Sneaky Americans. They get the movies first, and I don't quite know how it happened because they are bigger than us, but they got the book out about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, I think. So it's been out in America for a while, technically it comes out on the 20th of October here. So.
Brilliant. So you can, if you're watching online, you can pre-order that and it'll get to you 20th of October. If you're here in the room, you just have the rest of this event and then you can buy it at the back. Pete, one of the funniest moments in the book is actually at the very end. This is obviously going to go global. Redmond Rising is now translated into millions of languages, and it's going to go all over the world. Not millions. There aren't millions.
Almost literally dozens.
Yeah. Almost literally dozens. So it's going to go all over the world. And so, Pete, you wrote a little bit at the back, which was to sort of a note to your American friends to sort of translate your Englishness across cultures. And I wondered whether you might read that little snippet for us, because it has to be from you in your lovely English accent.
Okay. The background was my American publishers said to me, look, we're going to have to translate your spelling and your sort of written accent into American English, obviously. And I said, what do you mean, obviously? Please, can you not do that? It will sound very weird. Anyone who knows me will say, why is he referring to, pants when he means trousers and things like that? And they said, well, surely it's not that different. And I said, trust me, American English and English are very different. And they looked at me blankly, and fortunately I had a brainwave, and I said, look, J.K. Rowling and C.S. Lewis did okay, didn't they? And you sort of suddenly saw the dollar signs. They went, oh, yeah, I write in English. But they said, can you just put a note to explain everything at the back? So this is just entitled, A Note to My American Friends. Dear cousin, my publisher in Colorado has carefully weeded from the pages of this book many of my trickier, more befuddling English expressions, whilst attempting to retain the quirky, old-world weirdness of the way that I spell. Of course, this may well have been a terrible mistake, as the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw observed, England and America are two nations divided by a common language. When we lived on the great Midwestern plains, we certainly encountered endless, subtle, occasionally hilarious cultural and linguistic differences between your version of English and ours. For instance, when you say pants, we hear underwear. This can be unsettling when you think that the school receptionist is publicly admiring your smalls. Similarly, when you talk about your purse, we picture a wallet, and when you say football, we assume you mean a game involving a foot as well as a ball. Your chips are our crisps and our chips are your fries. Our state schools are your public schools and your public schools are our most exclusive private schools. We call a vest a waistcoat and an undershirt a vest. Your train tracks are our braces are your suspenders, and your suspenders are an intimate item of lingerie for English ladies. We have absolutely no idea what you mean when you say words like duplex, faucet, zucchini, and rutabaga. You say tomato and we say tomato. What else? Well, when you talk about falling on your fanny, or introduce yourself as Randy, we hear something different. I'd rather not explain. Unfortunately, we also refer to pitchers as jugs. No one warned me about this until an unfortunate conversation one Sunday breakfast with the pastor's wife at a mega church in Florida. I'll leave the embarrassment to your imagination. We are indebted to you, America, for so many reasons. You have given us Disney, Robert Frost, Elvis, and West Wing. For these we're grateful, and in return we offer you Shakespeare, the Beatles, C.S. Lewis, and Downton Abbey. We appreciate the fact that God has blessed you with Silicon Valley, perfect dentistry, and Chuck E. Cheese, whilst giving us the lesser-known delights of haggis, cricket, and the ultimate ability to make a decent cup of tea. Here in the old world, the word root does not rhyme with doubt, but with boot, toot, fruit, shoot, and loot. Blame the French. You'll have noticed that we also spell things differently, like aluminium, notice that extra I, colour and honour with a U. And for most of these offences, you can also blame the French. We call diapers nappies, baby strollers are actually pushchairs, sidewalks are pavements, the trunk of your car is the boot of ours, a truck is really a lorry, and a highway is a motorway. And while we're on the subject of driving, we do it on the left for a very good reason. To ensure that our sword hands are free to attack approaching knights. You are, as a nation, currently in grave danger from oncoming knights. God bless America. God save the Queen. God help us communicate. P.S. If you're Canadian, South African, Australian, or from New Zealand, this list, like so many things in life, only half applies to you. It's a bit depressing that everyone wants me to read the appendix of the book, if I can be honest with you.
Brilliant. I hope anyone watching online in America will appreciate that little explanation. I actually never knew that about the swords.
I think that's why, isn't it? Yeah, that's why.
Jeremy Jennings says that's why, so he's always right.
Jeremy has a full lance attached to his wing mirror, just in case. But he's a little older than me.
So if you do read Dirty Glory, make sure you read right to the end to read the best part, which comes at the very end. Are
you referring to the study guide, Hannah, that you wrote?
No, I'm referring.
It is the best bit of the book. The study guide is the climax, really, of the book.
It's certainly not, but hopefully it will be helpful if you use it. Great. Well, there's a number of protagonists in the book, a number of main characters, and we've already talked about them a little bit. So we've got Brian Heasley, we've got Kelly Teetsor out in Boys Town, and we've also got John Peterson in the States. So we thought we'd give you a little flavour of some of their stories, and we're going to start with Kelly in Boys Town. So, Pete, do you want to tell us a little bit about her before we read that?
Yeah, Kelly is just an extraordinary person. Actually, when we did the book launch in the US, Kelly came and joined me for the interview. And this isn't Kelly, this is Jessica. Kelly is a petite American from the buckle of the Bible Belt who God called to go and bring his grace and his goodness to a walled city of prostitution where she found 3 generations, grandmothers, mothers, and daughters locked in prostitution. And this has been going on, as I say, for a century and a half. And it began with prayer. And the mafia run this place. It's a sort of Jackie Pullinger story of our time, really. And she sort of read Red Moon Rising. And I remember meeting her for the first time, and she was holding this tattered copy of it. And she's going, "It's all your fault that I'm there." And she was sort of trying to hit me with this stupid book that I thought only my mum would ever read. And actually, she's a dear friend, and she's one of the most courageous and remarkable people. She sums up prayer, mission, and justice.
One of the women was wearing a white bikini top with jean shorts and smoking a large cigar. The other one had pulled her grey t-shirt up to reveal her naked breasts. When they saw us coming, they began to smile and wave. "Hola," the lady screamed, throwing their arms around Kelly. "Buenas tardes." "Hey, let me introduce you," laughed Kelly. "Nora and Cubana, this is my pastor from America. His name is Roger Nix. And this is my friend Pete. He's from England." I wasn't entirely sure how to greet a topless woman in a place like Boys Town. For a moment, I considered a handshake. But Cubana came in for a hug, smelling like smoke and pickled jalapenos, and then, with formalities dispensed, the three women were off, talking frenetically in Spanish as if they hadn't seen each other for years. Roger and I stood there a little awkwardly, grinning inanely, laughing at jokes we didn't understand. Nora paused to take a drag on her cigar and flashed a single gold tooth in my direction. I smiled back, trying desperately to maintain eye contact, trying not to let my gaze wander south. Kelly had been hoping that we might bump into Nora and Cubana that night. To know Cubana, she told us grandly, is to know Boys Town. No one knows how long she's been there, least of all Cubana. She's kind of a fixture of the place, a symbol of it all. The three women linked arms happily, Kelly in the middle, Cubana still topless, Nora still puffing on that large cigar, and they set off walking. "Nora's invited us to her place," called Kelly over her shoulder. How on earth did I ever get here, I wondered, feeling a very long way from home. Nora welcomed us into her dilapidated room like a duchess receiving visitors to her castle. "Bienvenido," she said, flicking the stub of her cigar out into the street and indicating a couple of white plastic chairs. I sat down next to a deep fat fire as Nora busied herself making tea. Cubana had disappeared, but Roger folded his lanky frame into the other plastic chair, and Kelly perched herself on the edge of the bed. Above us, a fan on the ceiling lazily stirred the hot, heavy air. The room was lit by a single fluorescent tube. On the wall, there was a colossal, incongruous mural depicting Santa Claus. And by the window, I noticed a selection of confectionery for sale. Kelly had often seen people unconscious on the floor in here, so she knew it wasn't just candy. Outside, I could see women lining the dirt road in their underwear, haloed against brightly lit doorways like plastic mannequins in empty shop windows, waiting to be dressed. Some were girls trying to look like women, some were women trying to look like girls. Every minute or so, a faceless predator would prowl slowly past in a growling pickup or a car with tinted windows. It was all strangely sexless. I had wondered if I might feel angry on my first night in Boys Town. I'd feared I might feel aroused, but in fact, all I felt was a vast and overwhelming sadness. A small, rounded man appeared at the door, blocking my view, holding a Spanish guitar. "Ah, mariachi!" exclaimed Kelly with delight, immediately inviting him inside. "It's a Mexican tradition," she explained, "folk music." With a flourish, he strolled into the room, squeezing his portly frame between Roger's chair and mine to station himself beside Kelly beneath Santa's cheery gaze. Then he threw back his head and began crooning like Julio Iglesias. Nora was handing tea to Roger, Kelly was reclining with Father Christmas, and we all just grinned and tried to sing along. I glanced at Kelly's pastor, sitting in the other plastic chair. He was singing along with Julio at the top of his voice, while Nora, our drug-dealing host, a semi-retired hooker in a white bikini, was trying to serve him tea. I'd always liked Roger, but I was about to fall in love with the guy. Here he was, paying a pastoral visit to a member of his flock, half a world away from Tulsa, Oklahoma, yet he seemed to be completely at ease. Roger's the kind of pastor who encourages everyone he meets. He's a lover of people, a faithful husband, and a fun-loving friend. Watching him now, singing his heart out in Nora's home, holding his tea aloft as if it was a flagon of German ale, I remembered the dramatic way he'd been called into church leadership, late one night, alone, in a 24/7 prayer room. It had been a holy thing, the details of which he rarely shared. Slowly, deliberately, Roger stood up, put down his tea and reached out a hand to touch Nora's shoulder. She winced and spun around to search for his eyes for clues, expecting the inevitable assault, but Roger just smiled, completely unfazed. Carefully placing his other hand on her other arm, he politely invited her to dance, as if her bikini was a ball gown and she was queen of the prom. Glancing at Kelly for reassurance, Nora relented. Seeing this, the mariachi strummed flamenco and sang even louder while the Tulsa pastor innocently took the former hooker in his arms and began to guide her gently around her little room. Nora smiled, flashing that one gold tooth, enjoying for a moment the sense of dignity in the company of a man without any ulterior motive. Outside in the street, men were prowling, inflamed with lust, and women were selling themselves too broken to care. But inside Nora's tiny house, that night, the mariachi sang. Nora danced, and I swear I sensed the Father smile. It was an exquisite picture of grace, one of the most beautiful dances I'll ever see.
Such a beautiful story. What was that like to be there for that moment?
It was what I said. It was just exquisite. And, you know, one of my publishers said, you really want to write this stuff? This isn't what we normally have in a Christian book. But I said, this is the real world. And, you know, Jesus made friends with prostitutes, and his reputation was quite important. And I also think this is a picture of what the Bible says, that whilst we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We were there, as it were, in our bikini with our cigar in our mouths, in our broken state, and he reached out and we thought he was going to assault us, and instead he gave us dignity and invited us to dance. To me, that is the gospel in that dance. It's the dignity that the love of God brings, the holiness, the redemption of God. And we all have different equivalents. We don't tend to look like that particular woman in that situation, but we are all in some kind of a messed up, broken state. So I remember at the time thinking, this is utterly surreal and utterly beautiful. And it's glory in the dirt.
Beautiful. Another one of my favourite stories in the book features Brian Heasley. Brian is the director for 24/7 Prayer in Great Britain, and he's a mission pioneer and just a great hero of the faith who established our work out in Ibiza. And we're delighted that he's here with us tonight. Brian, could you come and join us? Welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for being here. Now, Brian, Pete tells quite a lot of your story in Dirty Glory, and I know a lot of us probably already know some of the headlines of Brian's story. He's got a book here as well, Gate Crashing, which if you haven't already read, definitely it's a must read. It's available at the back at the end of the evening, or online if you're watching on the live stream. So a lot of us already know some of the headlines, but actually I was really surprised in reading this that there's a lot of stuff in there that we haven't heard before. How did you feel reading that and reflecting back on your journey?
I was quite surprised as well. And then Tracy, my wife, actually said to me, how does he know all this stuff? And then I remembered he takes notes when he talks to you, so be careful. But yeah, no, it was great. Pete feels like my biographer. No, I'm only joking.
Well, we're going to hear a little bit more from Brian in a minute, but first, let's hear some of his story.
Hey Brian, remember me? Brian did remember. He'd been praying for the security guy from the nightclub all week. They chatted and he'd accepted the gift of a Bible, but he'd been drunk at the time, so you never knew. Of course, nice to see you again. Yeah, well, you know that book you gave me? Yep, it was a Bible, a New Testament. It's good stuff, mate. The bouncer was grinning enthusiastically, clutching a well-thumbed copy of the Jesus Loves Ibiza Bible, which the 24/7 team had been handing out all summer. I mean, it's a bit dull in places, but on the whole, I thought it was very good. He offered Brian the book, pointing to some spidery handwriting on one of the pages. I've made a few changes, just suggestions. How you can make it better, up to you. Brian laughed incredulously. Let me get this right. You've read the whole of the New Testament. Yeah, right. And you reckon you've improved it a bit? The bouncer nodded absent-mindedly, watching a girl in a miniskirt walk by before offering his corrected Bible to Brian once more. You do realise that this isn't just any book. We may have put a funky cover on it, but inside it's still just the same old Bible, the Word of God. Brian could hardly believe he was having this conversation, but he wasn't getting through. As far as the guy in front of him was concerned, he'd taken the time to read the book, he got some great ideas about how to improve on it, and he kindly offered his help. Brian took the corrected Bible and decided to be direct with him. Look, I'm seriously impressed that you read it. I'm really glad that you found it interesting. But, well, most people do agree that the Bible has kind of passed that whole editorial phase. It's been pretty much untouched since the Council of Trent in 1546. The bouncer just shrugged and said that he didn't care what the council thought, he was just trying to help. See what you think about my suggestions. He waved and disappeared into the crowd of young bodies flowing from bar to bar at the end of a long day on the beach and the start of an even longer night on the town. Brian stood silently for a moment, watching the faces go by. Sometimes he wanted to shake them, to wake them, to tell them that there can be more to life than 10 pints of beer, sex with a stranger, and puking on your shoes in the taxi home. He thought about the bouncer's surprising enthusiasm for the Bible and wondered how many others knew the meaning of the story that had unfolded 2,000 years ago, not so far away, just at the other end of the Mediterranean Sea. Did anyone in Ibiza realise how this ancient story had shaped their world? How the town in which they were partying, San Antonio, had been named after St. Anthony, a missionary like him? Brian sighed. Why should they care? In the broken-hearted words of Jesus, the crowds were confused and aimless, like sheep with no shepherd. Every fibre of Brian's being longed for them to find the Good Shepherd in the pages of these Bibles, the way that he had as a child, memorising its verses, and again as a young adult, serving time in prison.
And there's obviously a little clue, a little teaser there at the end of that reading that that you have had an interesting journey and a remarkable kind of story of faith in and out of prison, and you can read all about that in the book. But your kind of remarkable life journey led you to a point where Ibiza was being described in the papers, as Pete said, as a modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's the 24/7 prayer movement really felt this impulse that we must go. And you responded to that call, and how was that kind of moving there with a young family? How was that experience for you?
It, like all these kind of adventures we go on, they're kind of mixture of bittersweet, you know, but it was more sweet than bitter. But it was... I guess Helen Keller said, life is either a daring adventure or nothing. And I remember after speaking with Pete, after praying about should we go, I remember just sitting with Tracy and we said, you know, what's the worst that could happen? And the reality is we come back in a year and say we got it wrong. But then the only thing that would be stopping us would be pride. So the idea was that we go and we see what is the worst that could happen. And we didn't want to be those people who ended back on the... I think you regret more the things you say no to than the things you say yes to, apart from some obvious things that you shouldn't say yes to. But
You can read about those in the book as well.
Yes. That cliffhanger at the end will explain how I said yes to some things I shouldn't have done. But yeah, so it was a sense of we don't want to look back at later life and read someone else's story about how that they felt God called them to be and think that could have been us. And it was a sense of didn't really want to miss out, and a sense of adventure that God calls us on, a sense that as he empowers and touches our lives, that surely the least we could do is give him those lives and go wherever he asks us to go. So it was a journey of trust. Yeah.
And you can read all of those stories about Ibiza in Gate Crashing, which you can pick up tonight. And I do really encourage you to read that, particularly if you want to be challenged in those really uncomfortable ways. It's a brilliant book for that. And Brian, you've now read Dirty Glory.
Yep.
What was the impact of reading Dirty Glory on you?
That is relevant because I knew he was going to do that. Because it was several years after he became our national director that we discovered Brian hadn't actually read Red Moon Rising at any point at all. So it's so wonderful that he's at last read this one. I also wanted to clarify his years in prison were before he became our national director.
So having read Red Moon Rising last year, loved it. I'd dipped in and stuff. Yeah. Anyway, this book, Dirty Glory, I read a lot. I love books. I love reading. Three things it really did. One, it moved. I cry quite a lot anyway, but it moved me to tears on a number of occasions. Just absolutely, from the get-go, really. And there's a bit in there where Pete talks about going on adventures, and actually I read that and I said, we were driving from somewhere, and I said, Pete, it makes me want to go on another adventure. And if so, I'm 46, which isn't old, but it's not young. But there's a sense in reading a book like that I want to go on another adventure. And then I'd read it in the kind of internet form that he had sent me, but then I got the book and I read the first chapter last week, just sat down and thought, I'll reread this. And I read Punk Messiah, the first chapter, and there was a moment where I just had to stop and put it down, and just in tears again. But the only response that evoked in me was, "I love you, Jesus. I love you, Jesus." So there's a book here that calls us to adventure. There's a book here that moves us to tears. But there's a book here that will deepen our love and our passion for Jesus. And that for me was just, yeah, I love all that. Yeah.
Pete, how do you feel hearing that?
Well, that's all I ever wanted for the book. My fear in doing a night like this, or, sort of, when Red Moon Rising came out, we only did one media interview, and they came to us because we didn't know anyone, and now I have to go around and talk about the book. And genuinely, if you were listening to me when I'm talking to the Lord on my own, the thing I'm saying is, God, I want people to see you. I want people to fall in love with you. And in the vision poem, it begins, the vision is Jesus, dangerously, obsessively, undeniably Jesus. And that is still, the vision is as unoriginal as that. I want people to be impressed and obsessed with Jesus, because it is out of his presence that everything else changes. So when I hear my friend say, I put the book down and started telling Jesus I loved him, to me that's mission accomplished.
Amen. Well, we're going to make space for some questions in just a moment. So, Brian, if you're up for staying up here, people might want to ask you as well. But before we do, we're going to just have one more reading, our final reading for the night. And this chapter is about John Peterson. You boys are misbehaving on the stools. And John Peterson is our final hero for the night. And this reading is titled, Giving God a Joint.
Back in the 1970s on the west coast of America, the Jesus movement was in full swing. John and Mindy Peterson began a Bible study in a barn with 15 people. Within 2 years, it was a church of 500 feral hippies, 5% of the town's entire population. John and Mindy's new congregation mostly lived off the land, many in teepees and tree houses, weaving their own yarn, dropping acid, and experimenting with shamanism. One of their first baptism services took place in a Rosicrucian nudist colony in the Siskiyou Mountains. You had to be real careful where you put your hands, laughs John whenever he tells the story. One day, a beanpole called Terry, with long hair and long tie-dyed robes, approached John, smiling. "I just came to Jesus, man," he said. "Awesome. Yeah, but I need to know what to do now." Terry looked around as if he didn't want to be overheard. He began fiddling with the beads around his neck. "The thing is," he said, "I've got a garden." "Okay," said John reassuringly, "God likes gardens." "No, you don't understand," said Terry. "It's pretty big, man." "Yeah, that's fine, Terry. The Garden of Eden must have been pretty big too." "But it's all just marijuana," said the hippie, "and it's big. Hidden away up in the forest, like it's worth about $300,000. What do I do with it now I'm with Jesus?" John thought for a moment. This guy was farming marijuana on an industrial scale. It was his livelihood, but it was also massively illegal. "Terry, you've got to burn it. Not just because it's hash and it's illegal, but because it's got your heart." Later that night, deep in the forests of Oregon, dozens of hippies in caftans, beads, and overalls arrived at a particular location in pickup trucks carrying burning torches. Many of them gasped at the sight of the largest quantity of pot they'd ever seen. Solemnly, Terry knelt by his handiwork, praying a prayer to dedicate his marijuana to Jesus. "May this be a pleasing aroma unto thee, O Lord," he said, with feeling. And everyone laughed their amen. And then, carefully checking the wind direction and ensuring that no one had accidentally strayed downwind, they offered God the biggest, holiest spliff you can imagine, and went home rejoicing, laughing, and free.
So we're going to just make a bit of space now for any
This
questions.
book's actually going to upset some people, isn't it? I'm only just realising.
So if you are feeling upset by what you've just heard, if you have a question that you would like to ask Pete, Holly is going to run around with this little mic.